Okay, I'm back again with my 180 gallon freshwater tank with refugium setup. You'll have to bear with the light. The new iOS 6 for the iPhones removed the ability to turn the light on and off while taking video. So good job, Apple. Thank you very much for being retarded. So I want to talk about the actual filter and a little bit more in depth here and just focus on the sand bed and the fluidizer that I have going on. It was brought up in one of the YouTube comments about using a finer sand to get a better fluidization. Okay, now as you can see, you know, obviously the bubbling parts are what's fluidized, and then you can tell over here that there's you know, sand that's stagnant that eventually just kind of rotates all in and finally gets fluidized, but there is quite big portion that's just stagnant. You know, it has a rotation, you know, that eventually will get sucked in and get, you know, rotated with the rest of the sand, obviously, but as you can see right now, it's just not moving. And I'll go to another angle here. Okay, you can see that there's, you know, there's movement in the sand, but there's definitely areas where the sand is just sitting there and eventually it'll get rotated through, but it's not all fluidized. Now what was suggested is that I use a finer grained sand because the kind of sand I have in here is pool filter sand, and pool filter sand is very thick and very coarse. You can almost see how thick the sand is on a nice zoom in. Okay, whereas if I go over to the refugium, I have a very light sand. You just tell the difference that the sand is just smaller, thinner. With that finer sand, I was told that I'd get better fluidization, and I was also told that if I had this angle at a steeper angle, I would also get better fluidization. So I want to address that. Excuse me. This setup is not without heartache, a little bit of headache, and a lot of trial and error. It took me several designs to go through to get this set up the way I wanted it. And I shouldn't say the way I wanted it, I more should say a working setup. The other setups that I used would blow the sand right out of the area and leave nothing. The sand would just get pushed into the rest of the refugium, and well, it'd get pushed in this part and stopped by the filter, but this whole area would just be filled with sand, and I'd have to vacuum it all out, you know, put more sand in there and try again. The reason being, even though this is gravity fed, it's gravity fed through 1,200 gallon per hour system. So that's a lot of force, and because it is not a complete siphon, the drain gulps air. And even though I have a silencer on it so you can't hear it very much, it's constantly gulping air, and you can see the little air bubbles coming up through there. That is not from any like air device. Those are not plugged in or turned on. That is just from the gravity fed system gulping air on its way down like you would, you know, drain a sink. Now you can see I'm not sure if focusing will help there, but nope, that helps. See how little particles of sand there floating around? Okay, that is all from the agitation and the bubbles that kick it up. In a big bubble will kick up a ton of sand. Okay, this is what eventually leads to having a completely empty fluidized sand bed filter, is all these little particles of sand leaving the system. So the reason why my angle here is so extreme, and I have different angles and different systems going in these different ways, is it's all to stop the flow of water. So the flow of water has to change in extreme measures in order to leave the system. The dirt doesn't want to follow those changes. The dirt wants to go in a nice, easy flow. It doesn't want to go over sharp angles. It doesn't want to go up ledges. You know, it'll go straight up. It'll go up steep ledges, but you give a long sloping one, it just won't take the time to stay afloat while going over that long, steep area. So as you can see, the sand moving around in here, the water flow when the water flows up, it wants to hit this, but it can't go anywhere. There's no, on the top here, the water does not flow over this piece of acrylic. So the water comes up, hits this, and the flow dies. There's not actually any water flow here. So all this agitated sand is just rising and falling back down. It wants to go this way, but there's no actual flow of water because this stops the flow of water when it pushes up and goes this way. So the flow of water comes up, and then the water actually comes back down to come up through this area here. That's where the sand starts to get confused, and you can see it. You can clearly see the sand here. Let me get a good, better focus there. Okay, the sand wants to come up. Okay, you can see the particles come up. Then you can watch the particles come over. It's trying to follow the flow of water that went up. Okay, so the flow of water that wants to come up, but then the flow of water pushes back down, so it pushes the sand back down with it, and you can see all the particles of sand trying to go with the flow of water. And the particles of sand following the flow of water hit that slope, and you can see them all just sliding back down, back into the sand. And then any small particles, like one or two that come up through there, have to come up and then overcome another water flow direction change to this way. So they hit and fall back down. So that's the reason for the dramatic, the very long sloping edge that I have there, and the incredibly heavy sand. The coarse, heavy sand takes more effort to fluidize, and if I had lighter, thinner sand, it would fluidize much better. But this heavy pool filter sand doesn't want to, it just contains weight, so it doesn't want to flow throughout my whole filter system and just get pushed out. So if I back up here, and we'll go over it one more time. Okay, the sand rate gets pushed up. Alright, now the water flow is an up, change direction back down. Okay, so the sand goes up, comes back down. Now we're already in favor of gravity, so the majority of the sand is just going to fall right back down because gravity is already taken over, and the water flow is just now helping gravity pull the sand back down to the bed. So the water comes up, changes direction, comes back down, loses sand here. Any sand that is kept with the force of the 1,200 gallon per hour flow comes through here. The water changes direction again, so the sand is coming up through here, still having to fight gravity, and then it changes directions again, comes up here and hits this wall to change direction to go this way. So any sand caught up here is going to hit and bounce again, and by this point you're almost to no sand at all. Depending on how high I had, this is the steady level. This has been running for several months now. I did have more sand in here, and because of the level, there was enough sand that it did get pushed out, and I'd have small clumps of sand down here before I had the rock filter bed. I put in the rock filter bed last so I could see how much pool filter sand, or how much fluidized sand I was actually losing during this system. So that's the reason why I have these extreme angles. I have this here so water can hit it and roll back down. Basically air bubbles and sand that would explode, not the water. Excuse me, I misspoke. So any air bubbles that bring sand, any large explosions or pockets of air that would pull sand that would pull all the way up to the surface, could hit this and roll back down without rolling over. Because this stops the water flow, water doesn't flow this way, water goes up and then down. So that also pulls down. The water then flows up, changes degrees, turns this way to flow this way. Any sand coming with it, again, hits this barrier, and then has to change degrees again to go over this to hit to the waterfall. Those are all measures, including the pool filter sand, the actual weight of the pool filter sand. Everything there is a measure done to keep the sand from getting pushed out of the filter area. I had a bunch of different designs, different ideas, from changing the water pressure by drilling holes in the pipe here. So when the water hit, it would hit the pipe, and some of the water would leave through some of the higher holes that weren't in the sand. So when it came down, it would not have as much water pressure to kick up as much sand. That actually had more of an opposite effect. It would not, during a power outage, it would not reinitialize the fluidized sandbed. The sand would actually just sit there and plug the bottom hole, and all the water flow would go out through the drilled holes, and it would just back up my system because there just wasn't enough holes to have the water, flow efficiently. And then if I had more holes in it, then it just wouldn't use the sand, it just wouldn't push any sand at all. I also use cylinders. I have a couple cylinders. Let me bear with the walking here. Here's my junk pile. I used these cylinders here. Get a picture of that. I had these hanging inside the tank like this. And then, these are just, very crude ways of letting water exit the system. And I had this full of sand. Got awesome fluidization from that. Like the whole thing was just boiling, bubbling. With the whole thing was so fluid. But all the sand would get pushed out. There was just too much force. So then I had a what's called a spaghetti cooker. And it's just it's kind of like these cylinders here. This is a cylinder that holds assorted zip ties, by the way. For a smaller system, that would work just fine. So if it didn't have the 1,200 gallon per hour push, it would have worked just fine. But so then I used a spaghetti cooker that was just a long cylinder. It ran the entire length. It wasn't hanging. It ran the whole length from top to bottom of this 50-gallon tank. And that I used basically a filter sock. I put a filter sock on top of the opening and ran a pipe through the filter sock, basically stitched like a little elastic skirt. So the filter sock would keep the sand inside the cylinder, because the sand wouldn't go through the filter sock. The filter sock was too fine. But because of the filter sock being that fine, it also extremely restricted my water flow, and I just didn't have enough water flow that my system would just back up. And those are, I'm explaining two of several various different tries, various different designs of how to get this thing to work, and this is really what came out to work the best. So not all of the sand is fluidized, but the system works. So if I had a steeper angle, I wouldn't have as much sand. I might have better fluidization of the sand that I had in there, which would pretty much be almost identical to what I have now. But then I wouldn't be able to hold as much sand. Sand would get pushed out easier, and just cause more headaches. So while you can see there is still sand there that is not, getting moved, it eventually gets rotated into the system anyway, so it's still going to get its bacteria. There's plenty of oxygen in the water. The bacteria is still going to thrive on it. The whole system doesn't need to be fluidized. That's not a big deal. So I hope that clears everything up. If you have any questions on other or suggestions, videos on what you guys have done, please feel free to let me know. This was a very long process of trial and error. Not a whole lot of people had these fluidized sand beds. They had gravity-fed fluidized sand beds. They had air-fed, using a bubbler or something to try to create the fluidization, and nobody really addressed the fact of sand getting pushed out of the system. And some of the systems I saw online, you could clearly see that a lot of sand was leaving the system. So maybe they're just content with refilling the sand. That defeats the purpose, because the bacteria needs to form on the sand, and that takes a long time as it is. So to have to replace that with clean new sand, I don't know, that doesn't make sense to me. You're defeating the purpose to have the fluidized sand bed filter anyway. So this is what worked. Give a little bit of video of it for a minute. Those pipes in there do run all the way down to the bottom. They're like a quarter inch from the bottom, just enough for the air or the water can freely spray out of it and cause the sand. But those pipes do go all the way down to the bottom. I'd also get better fluidization if I took those two heaters out of there, because they're just in the way, they block it. But those two Jagger heaters are actually taller than this entire tank. So this was the only place in this tank where the water level is as high as it is, and even then I have to have those heaters at a angle just to fit them in there. Those two heaters will go in my 200-gallon setup, but and I'll replace them with probably 12-inch, maybe 10-inch heaters for this, and that way they'll fit nicely, and I can put them elsewhere inside this tank. I don't like having anything in my tank above. I don't have any power cords or anything going in there, so everything is down here and hidden inside the tank. Well, thanks guys. This has been a long video, and hopefully, like I said, it clears up a little bit of the confusion about why things look as they look, or why I did what I did here with this crazy sloping angle, and you know, these different bends here, what they do, and why and how they react, so I can show, you know, how the sand actually flows with the water. And that's all because of the angles. You can see my really shoddy silicone job on those right there, because like I said, this was a learning experience, and I had a hard time getting my fingers in there to do a nice clean seal like those are. Nice, even, and clean. I basically just couldn't do it. I couldn't get my fat, pudgy hands in there. So here is the not the greatest looking silicone seals on there. The next one I'll do, I'll have a logical order now that I know what works, and how the water and the flow rates interact with the sand. Now that I know all that through experience, I'll be able to put in those slopes and put in those dividers in a logical order that I'll be able to get to the seams and do everything in a professional manner. But okay, everybody, hope you enjoyed. Like I said, if you have any questions or comments or suggestions, feel free to post them. Thanks, guys. Bye.